Thank you, Can Corla. As one who participated and lived through that era, I think it's appropriate that some of us of that vintage should make some comment. I was a member of the Health Board during that entire period, and I was a member, a backbencher in government during quite a lot of that period, and I can remember it well. I have no difficulty in recollecting it at all, and the way it happened. And what has now been presented as a strategy to deprive somebody, it was not. It was a policy to attempt to accommodate people who had no hope of getting accommodation, who had no accommodation available anywhere to them, and who had, as long as there were public hospitals available with spaces like in our own county, in Naas, in Athy, and so on and so forth, and the need for more, they were able to accommodate those patients there for as long as was necessary. And a number of other places like Peamount did the same thing. No, look, I didn't interrupt you at all now, so listen to it. Then there came a situation, I'm only just recalling it as it was, and it was policy. It wasn't a strategy, it was policy, government policy, which albeit should have been reviewed, maybe could have been reviewed, maybe couldn't have been reviewed. But the situation always applied. And you know, I can understand why the opposition sees this as an opportunity to scourge the government, as in being in some way responsible for concocting this out of their evil minds, of course, and that then we can look back and claim against everybody, and the whole country will eventually end up claiming for something that should have been done at the time for want of there being a policy in place to deal with it. But what happened then was the excess accommodation required was dealt with by the health boards by way of applying for beds in the private sector, in the private nursing homes. And the overspill then was transferred to the private sector, only the overspill, to the private sector in a way to meet the accommodation requirements. It wasn't always sufficient, but it was an attempt to deal with the situation that was running out of control. Now we can say, in retrospect, but don't forget this, retrospection applies to everything that ever any government did in any case. And we need to realise that in that situation, we weren't the richest country in the world like we claim to be now. We're still not, but we certainly weren't at that stage. So there was an attempt made to accommodate, and a charge was applied by the health boards for nursing homes. And the reason for that was there were complaints from people, members of the public, who said that some people were making profit on the situation that was in operation. I don't know whether they were or not, but all we could do at that particular time was to try to accommodate their needs as they were at that stage, and maybe not having anybody to look after them. And when a situation arose where there was nobody around to look after the family, something had to be done. So it was thought up that a charge, like for instance the old age pension, or part of it, or 3/4 of it, or whatever, in return for which pocket money was given to the patients at the time. We objected to that at the time, as you will recall. It seemed to be punitive, but there wasn't any other way of getting the accommodation at that time. So we're between a rock and a hard place. And I'm not accepting responsibility for one moment for government policy, because at that stage I was a backbencher for nearly all of the time. But I was a member of the health board and subject to health board policy.
Please.
I would ask the people, the loquacious people on the opposite side, to please consider that we all have a right to speak. And it would be nice if you could silence everybody who had an opposing view, but I believe in the democratic way. It's the oldest way and still the best way. But I would say this, that we then went on to the situation whereby, as the problem got bigger, there was a necessity to increase the charge. Otherwise, it collapsed, and we weren't in a position to be able to provide any service. And by we, I say the people whose board I was on, the health board, or the government backbenchers or whatever, I don't mind, I accept full responsibility for those things. But we have to view them in the light of circumstances prevailing at that time, not in light of circumstances prevailing now, which are totally and absolutely different. And I know there will be people who will continue in the opposition to say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. And maybe they're right. But then maybe that could be applied to all people in the House. But maybe they're right as well, and maybe they're not. But the fact remains that we do have the right to speak. So we arrived at a situation then where it was Sinn Féin introduced it first. There was a campaign to, this wasn't on the need as such, but on the fairness of having a charge for accommodation. And it transpired that there was no legislation to enable the charges to be made. And that's fair enough. That didn't stop charges from being made before that. And so the legislation was produced, and it is now possible to charge. But what nobody has spoken about, opposition or anyone else, is the alternative system was way, way more costly. Way more costly. And no matter, and then the fair deal scheme was introduced in more recent times to try to accommodate the rising situation. So I think that it's no harm to remember, like situations like that, this will be always used by oppositions, whichever hue they are, to blame the government of the day and previously, and several governments. But if we have arrived at a situation whereby in future we're going to examine our conscience and decide that we're going to retrospectively address every injustice that was done, there'll be a lot of time spent on that, I can tell you, and we better realise that. And I want to finish with one thing, Can Corla. In another department, I had responsibility for a different situation, which, just to give you an example, you could, for instance, qualify for a contributory old age pension if you had in excess of 21 years contributions. So, and what happened was, if you had 19 years contributions, you got no pension. If you got 21 years contributions, you had 98% of pension. And I thought that was unfair, and I believe I was right. And when I was in a position to do something about it, specifically, I was in that department myself, and I said I wanted to do something about it, having put down countless questions about it in this House. I had all the information in relation to the cost, all the information in relation to the cost. And I remember, well, the first information I got was it would cost 700 million to change it. A lot of money that time. There weren't too many people putting up front, making offers as to who would like to concede in order to provide for the 700 million. And I tried that for a couple of years, and it didn't work, and I didn't achieve any success. And then I did my own review, in my own country way, as you know, Can Corla, as we do down the country, and I came up with a different assessment of the cost. I came up with an assessment that wasn't 700 or 800 million, it was just a simple 14 million. And I had erred on the Conservative side, because in actual fact, it was only costing 9 million. So I'm not saying that I was right or wrong, but we changed the system at the time for 9 million. And we did it because we were able to explain that the situation was such that the people would gain and society would gain as a result of the decision to deal with it now and introduce a pro rata pension. So that if you had 70% of the contributions, you got 70% of the pension. Try it in any court of law, any court you want. It'll stand up. If you had 50% of the contributions, you got 50%. But there were those who said at the time, 50% is no good. It's a lot better than nothing. And that's a fact. So, and that still stands. So I'm telling this by way of illustration of the circumstances that prevailed during the times that everybody else now is familiar with, and we have to recall them, but that's the kind of situation that we were in at that particular. Now, we don't claim any responsibility for doing what was deemed to be the right thing to do, and we probably wouldn't have got any credit for it. But the fact of the matter is this: there are things like that that happen every day to every government of every hue. And I would say, you know, the Attorney General, to my mind, is right. You have to have the moral consideration on the one hand, and you have to have the recognition for the factual situation in terms of two things: setting a precedent and also in the cost. So those things have to be borne in mind always in government. And the story is always told that if a minister or a deputy or anybody else wants to go beyond that, and the question is then raised as to how satisfactorily you intend to deal with this situation when it arises. If you set a precedent, are you happy to be blamed for the precedent? If you set a bad precedent, how will that fit? And if you spend money, which is a role for the Controller and Auditor General, who seems to have a view on these things as well. If you spend money in a way that is not as it should be, there are repercussions as well. So we better realise this situation is a very, very sensitive one. It's a very important one. It's a genuine one. There are hardships that were caused as a result of decisions taken at that particular time. But when we resolve them, we want to resolve them in a way that is able to stand up. The last point I want to make is this. I've heard this several times in this House. It's about a different subject. I understand why the opposition raised it. The question about the wrongdoings, the mother and baby homes, and the church's responsibility. Don't forget, society had responsibility as well. Society particularly took an interest in what was happening and allowed it to happen and walked away. And it wasn't only society in this country, but in adjoining countries as well. So the fact of the matter is this, when we criticise others, we have to look at ourselves as well and ask ourselves, how did that fit with society at the time? And the answer to that question is simply this: society went along with it. And that's what happened. And that's actually what happened. And the mothers and daughters will tell you that to this day. So be fair to us all. Recognise that it wasn't an easy time. That was not an easy time. Not in this country. And those who say, well, it only happened in this country, it did not. It happened in every country, to a greater or lesser extent. So, when we criticise all those who are responsible, we shouldn't exclude society, all of us. Thank you, Cancorla.